There are versions that suggest the lights appeared before the radar ever noticed anything wrong, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as if they were already there, waiting. Some believe the fighter jet was alone above the dark water, its instruments calm, its pilot focused when a glow began to form off the wingtip. Others claim the glow multiplied, small, deliberate points of light that didn't blink, didn't trail, didn't behave like anything the pilot had trained for. According to fragmented accounts, the lights didn't chase the aircraft, they paced it. Those who tell the story later say the radio went quiet in a way that felt unnatural, not static, not interference, but absence. As if sound itself had stepped back. The jet continued forward, engines steady, altitude holding, while the lights adjusted position with unsettling precision. No sudden movements, no aggression, just presence. There are versions that suggest the pilot tried to speak, not to command or report, but simply to acknowledge what he was seeing. The words, whatever they were, never reached anyone else. They dissolved somewhere between intention and transmission. What followed has been described in conflicting ways. Some say the jet began to descend slowly, almost carefully, as if guided. Others believe it lost control in an instant, pulled downward by something unseen. A few insist the lights changed formation, closing in, then spreading apart, right before the aircraft struck the sea. No explosion was ever agreed upon. No debris pattern ever settled into a single explanation. Just the idea of impact, followed by darkness, followed by silence that lingered longer than it should have. And the most unsettling part, according to those who repeat the story in low voices, is not that the jet went down. It's that the lights did not. There are stories that refuse to stay contained within a single version. This is believed to be one of them. What you're about to hear has been told and retold in fragments, whispered by those who claim to have heard pieces, reconstructed by listeners who noticed what didn't fit, and shaped by long stretches of missing information. No official explanation was ever agreed upon, and no single account managed to silence the others. Some believe the incident was nothing more than a tragic failure that happened to coincide with strange lights in the sky. Others suggest the lights were the central element and the crash merely the consequence. Between these interpretations lies a wide, uncomfortable space filled with uncertainty. This story lives in that space. It isn't meant to convince you of anything. It doesn't ask you to accept one truth over another. Instead, it invites you to sit with the ambiguity, to consider how little is truly known when events unfold far from witnesses, far from certainty, and far from any place where answers are easily kept. As you listen, you might find yourself forming your own version of what happened. If you do, you're not alone. Many who encounter this story end up wondering where they would place the line between coincidence and intervention. And if you're watching from somewhere in the world where the night sky feels especially wide, feel free to leave a comment saying where you're listening from. These stories travel differently depending on who hears them. If you choose to stay for what follows, consider subscribing. Not because this channel promises answers, but because it continues to explore the moments where explanations fall apart and stories begin. What comes next is only one possible telling. And even this version may not be complete. There are versions that suggest the pilot had already been awake longer than he should have been. Not exhausted, at least not in a way that would raise concern, but existing in that narrow space where routine replaces alertness. The kind of state where muscle memory carries the body forward while the mind drifts just far enough to miss what feels impossible. According to some retellings, the flight itself was uneventful. A familiar route over open water, dark sky, calm conditions, nothing demanding more than quiet vigilance. The cockpit lights glowed softly, instruments steady, the engine's rhythm constant enough to fade into the background of thought. It said that the first anomaly wasn't visual, it was temporal. Some believe the pilot noticed a discrepancy between what he felt and what the instruments reported. A moment where time seemed stretched, only slightly, barely noticeable, like the hesitation before a word comes to mind. The clocks still moved, the displays still updated, but something in his perception lagged behind, as if the present moment had developed a thin delay. There are versions where he dismissed it immediately. Pilots are trained to distrust feelings that can't be measured. Fatigue, stress, dehydration. There are explanations for most internal disturbances. So the pilot adjusted his posture, checked his breathing, scanned the instruments again. Everything appeared normal. It's believed the first light appeared shortly after. Not bright, not sudden, just a faint glow outside the canopy, off to one side, hovering where there should have been nothing but empty sky. Some versions claim it pulsed gently, while others suggest it remained perfectly constant, indifferent to motion or distance. The pilot didn't react right away. Stories often emphasize this point, that his stillness lasted longer than expected, as if his mind was trying to categorize the sight before allowing his body to respond. Training, after all, depends on recognition, and this glow resembled nothing in the manuals. According to fragmented accounts, he leaned forward slightly, adjusting his view, expecting perspective or reflection to explain it away. Instead, the glow held its position, neither drifting nor falling behind. That's when a second light appeared, then a third. They formed no recognizable pattern at first, just presence, points of illumination existing without context, without apparent source. Those who later speculated about the event often fixated on how calm the light seemed. No erratic movement, no aggressive maneuvering, just deliberate proximity. There are versions where the pilot attempted to report the sighting. In these tellings, his hand moved toward the communication controls almost automatically, but when he spoke, the response wasn't what he expected. Some believe there was no static, no interference, just a clean absence of acknowledgement, as if the transmission had gone nowhere. Others suggest he stopped speaking mid-sentence, not because the connection failed, but because the words themselves felt suddenly inadequate. How do you describe something that refuses to behave like anything you know? The lights, it said, began to reposition, slowly, not circling, not flanking, just adjusting their relative distance as if maintaining a precise relationship with the aircraft. One account suggests they aligned briefly with the jet's direction of travel, matching speeds so perfectly that their motion became indistinguishable from stillness. That was when the sensation returned, the temporal distortion. The sense that moments were elongating, stretching thin, while the jet continued forward unchanged. Some retellings describe it as pressure behind the eyes. Others liken it to the feeling of descending in an elevator that never quite arrives. The pilot checked the altitude again. Normal. Engine performance? Stable. Fuel flow? Within expected parameters. There was no mechanical reason for concern, and yet, according to those who imagine his internal state, a deep unease settled in. Not panic. Panic has urgency. This was heavier, slower, the feeling that something fundamental had shifted without triggering any alarms. The lights drew closer, not close enough to touch, just near enough to remove doubt that they were distant objects. Their edges were difficult to define, as if the glow refused sharp boundaries. Some versions claim their color changed subtly, cycling through tones that never quite resolved into a single hue. There are stories where the pilot considered evasive action. In these tellings, the thought crossed his mind, but never translated into movement. It's said that the idea of sudden maneuvering felt strangely inappropriate, as if the situation demanded observation rather than response, as if reacting would be a mistake. The sea below remained dark and unreadable. No reflection from the lights reached the surface, at least not in any way the pilot could discern. The horizon held steady, offering no clue that anything extraordinary was unfolding above it. Then came the sound, or perhaps the absence of it, Some versions insist the engine noise softened, not failing but receding, like a sound heard from another room. Others suggest the cockpit grew unnaturally quiet, as though the space itself had absorbed the vibrations. The pilot's breathing became louder in his own ears. It's believed that for a brief moment, he considered the possibility that what he was experiencing wasn't external at all, that the lights were a projection, a neurological event, a misfiring perception under stress. But the instruments didn't agree, and neither did the way the lights moved, responding, it seemed, to the jet's slightest adjustments. There are accounts that claim the pilot finally spoke again, not into the radio, but aloud, a question perhaps, or a statement meant only to anchor himself to the moment. Whatever he said was never recorded. And shortly after, according to every version that exists, something began to change. Not violently, not suddenly, just enough to make it clear that the situation was no longer under his control. There are versions that suggest the change wasn't marked by alarms, no flashing warnings, no urgent tones, no cascade of failures demanding immediate correction. Instead, it's believed the jet began responding just a fraction of a second slower than before, not enough to register as malfunction, not enough to prompt emergency procedures, but enough for someone trained to feel the aircraft as an extension of their own body to notice the delay. The controls still moved, the jet still obeyed, yet the connection between intention and motion felt softened. According to some retellings, the pilot tested this sensation carefully. A slight adjustment to pitch, a measured change in heading. Each response arrived, but with a subtle hesitation, as if the aircraft were considering the command before executing it. The lights mirrored these movements, not copying them, but anticipating them. That detail appears in several versions of the story. The unsettling impression that the lights were not reacting to the jet, but already aware of what it would do next. As though the relationship between cause and effect had loosened its rules. It said the pilot's focus narrowed. The cockpit faded to the periphery of his awareness, leaving only the lights and the strange space between them. Training teaches pilots to manage workload by prioritizing, but this was different. It wasn't a conscious choice. The rest of the world simply felt less relevant. The temporal distortion intensified. Moments stretched further apart, yet somehow passed more quickly. Some versions describe this as disorientation. Others describe it as clarity. The pilot's thoughts slowed, becoming deliberate, almost meditative, even as his heart rate climbed. There are tellings where he noticed something impossible. The lights were casting no reflections. Not on the canopy, not on the wing, not on the sea below. They existed without interacting with the environment in any visible way. Pure presence without consequence. That absence, more than their appearance, is what many storytellers later emphasized. The pilot checked his instruments again. Still normal. Every system that could be measured insisted that nothing was wrong. And yet, according to those who imagine his internal dialogue, the realization formed that whatever he was encountering did not operate within the same framework as those instruments. There are accounts where the pilot finally committed to action. In these versions, he attempted a controlled maneuver, not evasive, not aggressive, simply decisive, a way to reassert agency. The movement was clean, precise, practiced thousands of times before. The jet responded, but the lights moved first. They repositioned effortlessly, maintaining their relative distance as if the maneuver had been predicted, not matched, predicted. The pilot felt a tightening in his chest, not fear exactly, but recognition. The understanding that the usual logic of engagement no longer applied. Some versions claim this was the moment the descent began, not a dive, not a stall, a gradual loss of altitude, so smooth it almost felt intentional. The pilot corrected, bringing the nose up, adjusting thrust. The indicators complied. The jet stabilized briefly, then the descent resumed. There are disagreements about whether the pilot realized what was happening right away. Some believe he fought the change, repeating corrections, recalculating, trusting the data. Others suggest he hesitated, uncertain whether intervention was appropriate. The lights drifted closer, not closing in aggressively, just reducing the space between themselves and the aircraft, layer by layer. Their glow intensified slightly, not brighter but denser, as if the light itself had weight. The sound, or lack of it, deepened. Accounts vary wildly here. Some insist the cockpit grew so quiet that the pilot could hear his own pulse. Others describe a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. No single version dominates, but nearly all agree on one thing. The pilot stopped trying to communicate. The radio was still there, the controls still available, yet the urge to speak, to report, to explain, those impulses faded. It's believed he felt that whatever was happening existed beyond transmission, that words would only reduce it, flatten it into something unrecognizable. There are versions where the pilot thought of people, not in panic, but in sequence. Faces arriving gently, without emotional surge, a memory of laughter, a fragment of a voice, the smell of something familiar. These details appear inconsistently across retellings, but their tone is remarkably similar. Not fear, acceptance. The jet continued descending. The sea rose slowly to meet it, still dark, still unreadable. The horizon remained steady, offering no dramatic shift to mark the approach. Everything unfolded with an almost unsettling calm. The lights changed formation again. Instead of surrounding the jet, they moved ahead of it, slightly lower, slightly forward, like markers rather than escorts. According to some interpretations, this positioning felt intentional, almost instructive. The pilot's final actions are unclear. Some versions claim he eased the controls, allowing the descent to continue. Others believe he maintained resistance to the end, trusting the aircraft more than the inexplicable presence beside it. There are even tellings where he closed his eyes briefly, not in surrender but in focus. No version agrees on the exact moment of impact. Only that it happened without chaos, without fire, without spectacle, just the meeting of metal and water, followed by darkness. And afterward, according to every version that survives, the lights did not scatter. They lingered, hovering above the surface for a time no one can measure. Then, without urgency, they moved away, leaving behind questions that have never settled into a single answer. There are versions that suggest what happened next didn't begin in the sky. It began in silence, not the dramatic kind, no alarms, no urgent voices, no immediate reaction, just an absence that settled slowly, like dust after something heavy has passed through a room. According to fragmented retellings, the space where the jet had been felt suddenly larger, emptier, as if the night itself had noticed the loss. Some believe there was a delay before anyone realized the aircraft was no longer moving as expected. Not because of negligence, but because nothing about the situation announced itself as an emergency. The usual signals that accompany catastrophe were missing. What remained was ambiguity. There are tellings where observers, never clearly identified, never fixed in place, noticed the lights first, not the absence of the jet. Points of glow lingering above the water, steady and deliberate, as if concluding something. These versions stress how unnatural the stillness felt, no urgency, no reaction to what had just occurred. The lights, it said, eventually drifted apart, not scattering, not fleeing, simply separating, each one fading into the surrounding darkness until there was nothing left to mark where they had been. The sea below returned to its previous state, flat, opaque, indifferent, and that's where many stories pause, but others continue. Some believe the aftermath unfolded in layers, not events, that what followed wasn't defined by action, but by omission, by what didn't happen, by questions that were never fully formed, let alone answered. There are versions that describe a period of waiting. Time passed, though no one seems to agree how much. The sky remained unchanged. The water gave up nothing. No clear sign that something extraordinary had just taken place. The world, it seemed, preferred continuity over disruption. Those who later reconstructed the story often focused on this stretch of uncertainty, the idea that something could vanish without leaving behind a clear wound. No spectacle, no closure. Just the sense that something had slipped out of reach. It's believed that somewhere, someone expected an explanation. But explanations, according to many tellings, never arrived in a satisfying form. Instead, fragments surfaced. A sensor reading that didn't align with known patterns, a visual anomaly reported and then quietly dismissed. A timeline that felt compressed in places and stretched in others. None of these elements stood alone as evidence. Together, they formed only a suggestion. There are versions that describe conversations held in low voices, not formal discussions, not official briefings, just exchanges between people who sensed that what had occurred didn't fit comfortably into established categories. In these tellings, the tone is careful. Words are chosen not to define, but to avoid defining too much. Some believe the incident was reframed almost immediately, not as something extraordinary, but as something unfortunate, a tragic outcome with no further implication. This reframing didn't erase the questions, it simply placed them out of reach. Others insist the reframing failed. That unease lingered, that certain individuals couldn't shake the impression that something fundamental had been overlooked. These tellings often focus on subtle signs, disturbed sleep, repeated review of details that refuse to align, the quiet compulsion to revisit a moment that had already passed. There are accounts where people began to notice patterns, not patterns of data, but patterns of feeling, a shared sense that the incident resisted containment, that every attempt to reduce it to a single cause left something important behind. In these versions, the story spreads not through facts, but through resonance. Someone hears it and feels unsettled without knowing why. Someone else dismisses it, yet keeps thinking about it days later. The lights, in particular, take on a strange quality in these retellings. They are rarely described the same way twice. Sometimes they are soft, sometimes sharp, sometimes distant, sometimes intimate. The inconsistency itself becomes part of the story, as if the lights adapt to the perspective of the one remembering them. There are versions where the pilot's final moments begin to shift in tone. Earlier tellings emphasize confusion. Later ones introduce calm. Some suggest intention. Others hint at surrender. None of these interpretations can be traced to a definitive source. They evolve over time, shaped by the needs of those recounting them. What remains consistent is the sense that the event did not conclude when the jet met the sea. It continued, not physically but conceptually, in the spaces between conversations, in the pauses after someone says, "That doesn't make sense," in the quiet acknowledgement that not everything demands resolution. There are tellings where the sea itself becomes symbolic, an expanse that absorbs without reflecting, that accepts without revealing. In these versions, the water isn't just a setting, it's a participant, a keeper of whatever truth may have passed through that night. Some believe the lights returned, not immediately, not visibly, but as impressions, as dreams, as fleeting moments where the sky feels closer than it should. These claims are always tentative, always framed as personal experiences rather than shared events. And perhaps that's why the story persists, because it refuses to settle into something concrete, because it exists more comfortably as a question than as an answer. According to those who continue to tell it, the incident didn't end in loss alone. It marked the beginning of something else, a quiet shift. A reminder that there are moments when the sky does not simply observe what happens below, but participates in ways that leave no clear trace behind, and whatever followed next would only deepen that uncertainty. There are versions that suggest the story survived because it never asked to be believed. It simply lingered, not in official records or definitive statements, but in the way people hesitated when recalling that night, in the pauses that followed questions no one expected to answer. According to some tellings, the incident became something people referenced indirectly, as if naming it too clearly might give it a shape it refused to hold. Some believe the ambiguity was intentional, not imposed by authority or design, but by the nature of the event itself, that whatever occurred resisted being framed in familiar terms. Every attempt to assign cause, motive, or sequence seemed to flatten something essential. There are retellings where individuals tried to reconstruct the pilot's final decisions. They replay imagined moments, scrutinizing the smallest choices. Did he hesitate? Did he comply? Did he resist? Each version reveals more about the storyteller than about the pilot. The answers shift depending on who asks the question and why. The lights continue to dominate these reconstructions. Some accounts describe them as observers, present but detached. Others frame them as guides or markers, or even mirrors, reflecting something internal rather than external. No interpretation lasts long before another replaces it. That instability becomes part of the narrative. In some versions, people begin to notice a change in how they think about the sky afterward. Not fear exactly, more a heightened awareness. A sense that the familiar vastness above holds layers that rarely intersect with human experience. There are tellings where nights become heavier, where stars feel less decorative and more deliberate. These accounts never claim direct encounters. Instead, they speak of impressions, moments where the boundary between observer and observed feels thinner than usual. Some believe the incident influenced how certain individuals understood silence. Silence not as absence, but as containment, as a space where meaning accumulates without declaring itself. In these versions, the lack of answers becomes a feature, not a failure. There are accounts where conversations about the event end abruptly. Someone starts to articulate a theory, then stops, not because they've been interrupted, but because the explanation suddenly feels insufficient, as if completing the thought would reduce something complex into something manageable and therefore false. The pilot, in many retellings, becomes less a person and more a focal point, a point where multiple interpretations converge. Courage, confusion, acceptance, resistance, all attributed to him without certainty. His humanity remains intact, but undefined. He is remembered not for what he did, but for what he encountered. There are versions where the crash is barely mentioned at all. Instead, the focus shifts to what followed in the minds of those who heard about it. Sleepless nights, recurring thoughts, the uncomfortable realization that some experiences do not conclude neatly. The sea continues to absorb meaning in these stories. It becomes a metaphor for containment without disclosure, a place where events can occur without leaving evidence behind. According to some, this is why the story feels unresolved, not because information is missing, but because resolution was never available. There are tellings where the lights are never seen again, and others where they are, but never clearly. Never in a way that demands agreement. A glimmer at the edge of vision, a reflection dismissed too quickly, a memory that refuses to anchor itself in time. The story adapts. That's perhaps its most persistent quality. It changes shape as it moves, shedding details that become inconvenient and absorbing those that resonate. It becomes less about what happened and more about how uncertainty is carried forward. Some believe this is why the incident remains compelling. Not because it promises revelation, but because it denies closure. It leaves space for interpretation, for doubt, for the quiet discomfort of not knowing. There are versions where people eventually stop asking what caused the crash. They ask something else instead. What does it mean when something enters our world without explanation and leaves without apology? What does it say about the limits of perception, of control, of narrative itself? The lights in these reflections are no longer objects. They are symbols of interruption, of presence without permission, of moments that challenge the assumption that everything can be understood if examined long enough. And yet, despite the weight of these interpretations, the story never claims importance. It doesn't insist that the event changed anything fundamental. It doesn't demand belief or allegiance. It exists quietly, waiting to be encountered rather than accepted. There are tellings where someone says the incident taught them nothing, and others where it taught them everything. Neither claim can be verified. Both coexist. Perhaps that is the most honest outcome. The story survives not as a lesson, not as a warning, but as a reminder that sometimes events unfold without explanation, that sometimes silence is not a failure of understanding, but a boundary we are not meant to cross, and that whatever happened that night, whatever the lights were, whatever the pilot experienced, it remains suspended between possibilities, unresolved, unclaimed, and according to every version that endures, exactly where it belongs. There are versions that suggest the most profound effects of the incident emerged long after the sky returned to normal, not in visible changes, not in public reactions, but in the subtle recalibration of how certain individuals interpreted absence. According to some tellings, those who encountered fragments of the story began to notice how easily silence could be mistaken for resolution. The jet was gone. The lights were gone. The sea remained. To many, that was enough to close the matter. Yet for others, the absence itself became the unresolved element. There are versions where people stopped asking what happened and began asking why the question felt incomplete. This shift didn't occur all at once. It surfaced gradually, in conversations that drifted off topic, in pauses where someone considered speaking and chose not to. In these retellings, the story doesn't move forward. It deepens. Some believe the pilot's experience cannot be understood through action alone, that what mattered wasn't the descent or the lights or even the impact, but the internal state that preceded them. A narrowing of focus, a sensation of being observed without judgment, an encounter that did not demand response, only awareness. There are tellings where this idea becomes central, that the lights did not impose themselves but invited attention, that they did not interfere directly but altered the conditions under which decisions were made. According to these versions, the event was less an interruption and more a reframing. Others disagree entirely. They suggest the pilot's perception was compromised, that stress, isolation, and expectation combined to produce something convincing but ultimately internal. These accounts emphasize the danger of assigning meaning to experiences that occur under extreme conditions. Yet even these skeptical versions rarely dismiss the story outright. Instead, they acknowledge a discomfort that lingers regardless of explanation, a sense that something about the sequence resists full reduction. There are versions that describe a particular detail returning again and again. The calm. Not the calm of control, but the calm of inevitability. A quiet that settles not because danger has passed, but because struggle no longer feels appropriate. This detail appears across tellings that otherwise disagree on everything else. Some believe this calm is what unsettles listeners the most. Disasters are expected to be chaotic, fearful, loud. But this story offers none of that. It presents an ending without urgency, without resistance, without the emotional markers that usually signal crisis. There are accounts where people find this absence disturbing. They wonder whether the calm suggests acceptance or manipulation, whether it reflects clarity or the removal of choice. These interpretations shift depending on the listener's assumptions about agency and control. The lights, once again, become the focal point. In some tellings, they are described as indifferent, present, but unconcerned with outcome. In others, they are framed as purposeful, though not malicious. Their behavior is interpreted not as hostile, but as procedural, as if following rules unknown to human understanding. There are versions where this procedural quality becomes unsettling. The idea that something could operate with precision and intent without emotion, without communication, without explanation. That it could intersect with human experience briefly, decisively, and then withdraw without consequence. Some believe this is why the story resists categorization. It doesn't fit neatly into narratives of threat or benevolence. It offers no clear antagonist, no lesson, no warning, just interaction. There are tellings where the sea becomes less symbolic and more literal again. In these versions, the water is simply water, vast, absorbing, unconcerned. The meaning imposed upon it is recognized as human projection, an attempt to find structure where none is offered. Yet even here, the projection is not dismissed. It is acknowledged as inevitable. According to some storytellers, the need to interpret is itself the legacy of the incident, the way it compels reflection without offering resolution, the way it invites narrative without supplying conclusion. There are accounts where people attempt to imagine alternative outcomes. What if the lights had never appeared? What if the pilot had ignored them entirely? What if the descent had been arrested at the last moment? These questions never produce consensus. They exist only to highlight the fragility of assumed control. The idea that slight variations could have resulted in radically different endings. Some believe the incident challenges the notion of preparedness. Training, procedure, expectation, none of these seem sufficient when confronted with something that does not announce its nature. In these versions, the pilot's experience becomes emblematic of a broader vulnerability, not failure, limitation. There are tellings where this limitation is embraced, where the story is valued precisely because it reveals the edges of understanding, where uncertainty is not an obstacle to be overcome, but a condition to be acknowledged. In these versions, the lights are never explained because explanation would diminish their function. They serve not as objects to be defined, but as prompts, markers indicating where comprehension falters. The pilot, too, is remembered less as a casualty and more as a participant, not in a mission but in an encounter, someone who crossed a boundary not by choice but by circumstance, someone whose experience cannot be replicated, only imagined. And perhaps that is why the story continues to be told, not to uncover truth, not to assign blame, not to provoke belief, but to preserve a moment where certainty failed gracefully, where something unknown entered the familiar and left without leaving proof, where the sky did not reveal its nature, only its depth, and where, according to every version that survives, the most significant impact occurred not at the moment of descent, but in the long, quiet reconsideration of what it means to witness something without understanding it. There are versions that suggest the incident began to influence how people remembered other moments in their lives, not by inserting new details, but by recontextualizing old ones. Experiences that once felt insignificant, an unexplained delay, a strange light seen briefly, a moment of disorientation, were revisited through the lens of what had happened that night. According to some tellings, the story didn't add content to memory, it altered emphasis. Some believe this is how narratives grow, not through facts, but through association. One story reshapes another, creating a network of meaning that expands quietly over time. In these versions, the incident becomes less isolated, less singular, woven into a larger pattern of personal reflection. There are accounts where individuals begin to question the reliability of perception itself. They recall how confidently they once trusted their senses, how certain they were that seeing equaled knowing. The story unsettles that assumption. It suggests that perception may be complete yet still insufficient, that one can witness something fully and still fail to understand it. This idea appears repeatedly across retellings, not as a conclusion, but as a discomfort, a lingering doubt that does not demand resolution. People continue their routines. They sleep, work, speak, plan. Yet beneath these ordinary rhythms, the question persists. What if experience alone is not enough? The pilot's encounter, imagined and reimagined, becomes a reference point, not because it offers clarity, but because it exemplifies this tension. He saw the lights, he felt the changes, he acted, or didn't, within a context that resisted interpretation. His experience becomes a reminder that exposure does not guarantee comprehension. There are versions where this realization extends beyond the incident itself. People begin to recognize how often they rely on narratives to impose order, how quickly they reach for explanations that comfort rather than challenge. In these tellings, the story serves as a quiet critique of certainty. Some accounts suggest the lights function symbolically in this way. They appear without warning, interact without explanation, and depart without consequence. They do not teach, they do not threaten, they simply disrupt. Their significance lies not in what they do, but in what they refuse to clarify. There are tellings where this refusal becomes unsettling. Listeners express frustration. They want answers. They want boundaries. They want the story to resolve into something manageable. But it doesn't. Each retelling reinforces the same absence. And yet the story endures. Some believe it endures because it mirrors a common human experience, the encounter with something that exceeds understanding, a moment when expectation fails and interpretation falters. These moments are often minimized or forgotten, but here one has been preserved. There are versions where the incident is compared to a threshold, not a gateway to knowledge, but a boundary that reveals itself only when approached. The pilot, in these tellings, reached that boundary unintentionally. What he encountered beyond it remains undefined. This framing shifts the focus again. The lights become less important than the space they reveal, the gap between observation and meaning. The descent becomes less about loss and more about transition, not a movement from life to death, but from certainty to uncertainty. Some find this interpretation comforting, others find it deeply unsettling. There are accounts where listeners report a change in how they experience silence afterward. Silence no longer feels empty. It feels occupied, not by sound, but by potential, by the awareness that absence can contain as much significance as presence. This change doesn't manifest dramatically. It surfaces in quiet moments, in looking up at the night sky, in noticing how vastness resists articulation, in recognizing how little is required to disrupt familiar frameworks. The story, in these versions, becomes a companion rather than a warning. It doesn't instruct, it accompanies. It sits alongside the listener, offering no guidance, only perspective. A reminder that some encounters are not meant to be resolved. There are tellings where the incident is eventually spoken of less frequently, not because it's forgotten, but because it has been absorbed. Its questions integrated rather than answered. It becomes part of a background awareness, a subtle shift in how uncertainty is tolerated. The pilot remains central yet distant. He is not mythologized. He is not reduced. He remains a figure defined by encounter rather than outcome. His experience is honored not through explanation, but through restraint. Some believe this restraint is essential, that assigning definitive meaning would violate the nature of what occurred, that the story's integrity depends on its refusal to close. In these tellings, ambiguity is not a flaw, it is the point. There are versions where someone finally asks whether the lights mattered at all, whether they were cause, catalyst, or coincidence. The question is raised gently, almost reluctantly, and just as gently, it is left unanswered. Because the story does not exist to resolve that inquiry. It exists to hold space for it. According to those who continue to reflect on the incident, the most lasting impact was not fear, belief, or speculation. It was humility. The quiet recognition that the world contains intersections we may never fully map. That experience can be genuine without being interpretable. That meaning does not always arrive packaged as explanation. And so the story persists, not as evidence, not as warning, not as revelation, but as an invitation to sit with uncertainty, to acknowledge the limits of understanding without rushing to fill them. And as the narrative continues to unfold, what remains clear is this: the incident did not demand belief. It demanded attention. And even now, long after the sky returned to its familiar silence, that attention continues to shape the way the story is told and the way it is heard. There are versions that suggest the story began to change tone once distance replaced immediacy, not because new details emerged, but because the absence of urgency allowed reflection to take over. What was once experienced as an event slowly transformed into a reference point, something consulted rather than revisited. According to some tellings, this is when the incident became quieter. The sharp edges softened, the tension diffused. What remained was a low, persistent hum of contemplation. People stopped trying to reconstruct sequences and began to sit with impressions instead. The question shifted from what happened to what lingered. There are versions where those who knew fragments of the story found themselves returning to it during moments of stillness, late hours, empty rooms, open skies. The incident resurfaced not as fear, but as curiosity tempered by restraint. It no longer demanded resolution, it suggested patience. Some believe this shift reflects how humans metabolize uncertainty. At first, ambiguity provokes discomfort. It demands closure. But over time, if closure never arrives, the mind adapts. It learns to carry the unknown without exhausting itself. In these versions, the story becomes a case study in that adaptation. The lights, once the dominant element, begin to recede. They are still present in memory, but no longer central. Their role diminishes, not because they are explained, but because they no longer need to be. They have served their function as disruption. What remains is the effect. There are tellings where this effect manifests as restraint, a hesitation before asserting certainty, a pause before dismissing anomalies, a recognition that not all experiences fit clean frameworks. The story, in this sense, becomes formative rather than informative. Some accounts describe individuals who found their relationship with control subtly altered, not relinquished, but redefined. The assumption that every variable can be managed, predicted, or neutralized feels less stable. This realization does not produce fear. It produces humility. There are versions where the pilot's calm takes on renewed significance. Earlier interpretations framed it as acceptance or manipulation. Later tellings consider another possibility, composure born of recognition. The understanding that resistance is not always the most meaningful response. This reframing doesn't romanticize the outcome. It doesn't suggest choice where none existed. It simply acknowledges that agency can manifest as awareness rather than action. In these versions, the pilot's experience is honored through stillness rather than heroics. The sea, too, shifts in meaning. It is no longer a symbol of loss or concealment. It becomes a boundary, a place where narratives pause rather than end. The water holds nothing back. It simply does not offer anything forward. There are tellings where this interpretation brings comfort, the idea that not knowing is not failure, that absence of evidence is not absence of meaning, that some events are complete without being understood. Others find this unsettling. They prefer narratives with conclusions, with lessons, with outcomes that justify attention. This story resists those impulses. It offers no reward for scrutiny beyond the act of reflection itself. Some believe this resistance is intentional, not engineered, but inherent. The incident, as told, does not cooperate with expectation. It does not escalate. It does not resolve. It does not transform into something instructive. It remains itself. There are accounts where people stop telling the story aloud, not because it loses relevance, but because it becomes internalized. It shifts from shared narrative to private reference, a moment recalled silently when certainty feels too easy. In these versions, the story's survival depends less on repetition and more on resonance. It is not passed down through detailed retellings, but through subtle acknowledgement, a shared glance, a pause in conversation, a change in tone when the sky is mentioned. The lights, when referenced at all, are described almost apologetically, as if emphasizing them too much would distort the memory, as if their presence mattered less than the space they revealed. This restraint becomes a form of respect. There are tellings where someone attempts to finalize the narrative, to declare definitively what the lights were, why the descent occurred, what it all meant. These attempts rarely persist. They feel too sharp, too narrow, too confident. The story resists being pinned down, not through contradiction, but through incompleteness. Each attempt to finish it leaves something unresolved, prompting reconsideration rather than conclusion. Some believe this is why the incident remains compelling, not because it promises discovery, but because it invites reconsideration. It challenges the reflex to explain and rewards the willingness to observe. There are versions where this invitation extends beyond the event itself. People begin to notice how often they seek closure where none is required. How frequently they mistake explanation for understanding. The story becomes a quiet counterexample. The pilot's experience, though distant, continues to anchor this reflection. He remains a figure defined not by outcome, but by encounter. His story does not belong to resolution. It belongs to acknowledgement, and perhaps that is the most enduring shift. The recognition that some moments do not ask to be solved, they ask to be held. And as the story continues to circulate, not loudly, not insistently, but persistently, it carries this message forward. That uncertainty, when approached without urgency, can become not a threat, but a space where meaning settles slowly, without demand. There are versions that suggest the incident eventually stopped feeling like an anomaly and started feeling like a reference. Not a lesson, not a warning. A reference point, quiet, stable, and unresolved. According to some tellings, this is when the story settled into the background of thought rather than the foreground of conversation. It became something people returned to mentally when they encountered uncertainty elsewhere. A reminder that not all unanswered questions are failures of understanding. Some believe this transition marked the final stage of the story's evolution, the moment when curiosity matured into acceptance, when the need to explain softened into the willingness to coexist with ambiguity. In these versions, the incident no longer provokes speculation. It provokes reflection. There are accounts where people notice how their language changes after engaging with the story. They speak more carefully, they qualify their statements, they acknowledge gaps rather than rushing to fill them. This shift is subtle, almost imperceptible, but persistent. The story teaches not through instruction, but through tone. The lights, once vivid and unsettling, become abstract. They are no longer described in detail. Their color, movement, and formation fade from prominence. What remains is the idea of their presence, an interruption that required no explanation to be impactful. Some tellings frame this as the light's final transformation, from objects to symbols, from phenomena to prompts. They become shorthand for moments when understanding stalls, when certainty feels premature, when restraint feels appropriate. There are versions where the pilot's experience is revisited one last time, not to reinterpret it, but to release it. The impulse to assign motive, intent, or meaning gives way to a quieter recognition. The experience was complete in itself. It does not need framing to justify its significance. This release does not diminish the gravity of what occurred. Instead, it honors it, by refusing to impose clarity where none was offered. The sea, too, undergoes a final reframing. It is no longer a boundary or a symbol. It is simply where the story pauses, not ends, pauses. A place where motion ceased, but meaning did not conclude. There are tellings where this pause becomes essential, a reminder that not every narrative arc requires resolution. That some stories remain open not because they are unfinished, but because they are complete without closure. Some believe this is the story's quiet defiance. It resists the demand for answers without resisting attention. It invites engagement without offering payoff. It exists on its own terms. There are accounts where people eventually stop asking whether the lights were external or internal. The distinction loses urgency. The impact remains regardless of origin. Whether the encounter was rooted in perception, circumstance, or something entirely other, its effect persists. In these versions, the story's value lies not in classification, but in consequence. How it altered the way uncertainty is tolerated, how it softened the need for dominance over explanation, how it reframed silence as something other than emptiness. Some listeners describe a moment when the story finally settles, not with relief, not with clarity, but with recognition, a sense that they no longer need it to resolve, that its purpose has been fulfilled simply by being considered. There are tellings where this realization arrives unexpectedly, in the middle of a routine task, under an ordinary sky. The thought surfaces briefly, unannounced, uninvited, and then recedes, leaving behind a subtle shift in perspective. The story becomes less something remembered and more something integrated. It influences without announcing itself. It informs without instructing. It remains present without demanding attention. The lights, if thought of at all, are recalled without tension. They are no longer unsettling. They are no longer mysterious. They simply were. Their presence acknowledged, their nature unclaimed. There are versions where someone finally articulates what the story offers. Not an answer, not a theory, but permission. Permission to admit uncertainty. Permission to resist premature explanation. Permission to let experiences exist without being conquered by narrative. This articulation is rarely spoken aloud. It is felt. And perhaps that is why the story endures. Not because it insists on relevance, but because it accommodates it. It adapts to the listener's readiness. It meets them where they are. As the narrative approaches its final movement, what becomes clear is this. The incident did not fracture understanding. It revealed its limits. And in doing so, it offered something rare, a space where not knowing is not a deficiency, but a form of respect. There are versions that suggest the final phase of the story began when people stopped expecting it to end. Not abruptly, not deliberately, but gradually, as the narrative loosened its grip on chronology and settled into meaning instead. According to some tellings, this is when the incident ceased to belong to a specific moment and became something more diffuse. It no longer occupied a single night, a single descent, a single encounter. It existed across time, appearing whenever uncertainty surfaced without invitation. Some believe this diffusion is what preserved the story. Anchored narratives age. They become outdated, challenged, revised, but stories rooted in ambiguity adapt. They remain relevant because they refuse to claim authority over interpretation. This incident in these versions survives precisely because it does not insist on its own importance. There are accounts where people realize they no longer remember the sequence clearly, not the order of events, not the transitions, not even the precise role of the lights. What remains is impression rather than detail, a sense of calm paired with unease, presence paired with absence, movement paired with stillness. This erosion of detail does not weaken the story, it strengthens it. Details invite correction, impressions invite reflection. As specifics fade, the emotional core remains intact, untouched by contradiction. The pilot, in this final phase, becomes almost abstract. He is not recalled by rank, experience, or background. He exists as a consciousness encountering something beyond framework, a human awareness intersecting with a moment that did not accommodate explanation. There are versions where this abstraction is intentional. By removing personal markers, the story resists heroism and blame alike. It prevents appropriation. It keeps the encounter human without allowing it to be claimed. Some believe this is why the story never crystallized into doctrine or belief. It offers no structure to build upon, no rule to follow, no conclusion to defend. It remains fluid, open, resistant to institutionalization. The lights, too, lose specificity. They are no longer described as objects in space, but as interruptions in expectation, moments where familiar patterns failed to assert dominance. Their physicality becomes secondary to their effect. In these tellings, the lights could have been anything or nothing. What matters is how they altered perception. There are accounts where listeners eventually stop picturing the scene entirely. They no longer imagine the sky, the sea, the descent. The visuals dissolve. What remains is a sensation, a subtle tension between knowing and not knowing, a reminder that certainty is often a convenience rather than a necessity. Some find this realization liberating, others find it deeply uncomfortable. The story offers no reassurance. It does not promise safety, understanding, or progress. It simply acknowledges limitation. That acknowledgement can feel grounding or destabilizing, depending on the listener's disposition. There are versions where the incident is referenced in moments of decision, not as guidance, but as context. A mental note that not all variables can be controlled. That action sometimes unfolds within conditions we do not define. In these tellings, the pilot's experience becomes emblematic of that reality, not as a cautionary tale, but as a quiet example. Someone moving forward within uncertainty, encountering something that did not announce itself, and responding without panic or spectacle. The absence of spectacle remains one of the story's most persistent features. No dramatic climax, no definitive turning point, no revelation. This restraint frustrates some listeners. They want payoff. They want significance marked clearly. But the story refuses to comply. It withholds resolution not out of secrecy, but out of consistency. There are accounts where people realize this refusal mirrors something familiar. Life itself rarely provides closure. Moments blur into one another. Meanings shift over time. Answers, when they arrive, often feel partial or provisional. In this sense, the story feels honest, not factual, but honest. It does not exaggerate human agency. It does not assign cosmic importance. It allows the encounter to remain proportionate to the experience itself. The sea, now distant in memory, remains unchanged. It neither confirms nor denies. It absorbs without comment. Its role is not to explain, but to hold. There are tellings where this holding becomes the story's final offering, a reminder that some experiences are carried rather than solved, that understanding is not always the end point of significance. As the narrative approaches its final movement, what becomes apparent is not what happened, but what did not. There was no revelation, no warning, no transformation imposed from outside. Instead, there was a quiet recalibration, a shift in how uncertainty is perceived, a softening of the need to dominate explanation, a willingness to let experiences exist without conquest. And perhaps that is why the story remains, not because it insists on being told, but because once encountered, it is difficult to forget. There are versions that suggest the story's final movement did not arrive with emphasis, but with quiet alignment. Not a conclusion, not a revelation, a settling. According to some tellings, this is when the incident stopped asking to be revisited and began asking to be remembered differently, not as an event to analyze, but as a reference for how uncertainty can be carried without urgency. People stopped returning to the details. They no longer debated the light's position or the timing of the descent. They no longer tried to reconstruct what might have happened differently. The narrative loosened its grip on specifics and allowed the experience to stand as it was, unresolved and intact. Some believe this is the point where the story fulfilled its function, not by answering questions, but by changing the way questions were held. The pilot in this final telling is no longer imagined in motion. He is not climbing, descending, correcting, or reacting. He exists in a still frame, a moment of awareness suspended between intention and outcome. This stillness is not dramatic. It is ordinary, almost gentle. There are versions where listeners realize they have stopped feeling tension when recalling the incident. The unease fades. The mystery remains, but it no longer presses. It sits quietly, like a thought that no longer needs attention to persist. This shift is subtle, but meaningful. It suggests that the story has been integrated rather than resolved. The lights, now rarely visualized, are remembered as a presence rather than an image. They are not assigned motive or identity. They are acknowledged as part of the encounter and then released. Their refusal to clarify becomes accepted, even respected. Some believe this acceptance marks the story's true ending, not the impact with the sea, not the silence that followed, but the moment when the need to define finally dissolves. There are tellings where this dissolution brings an unexpected calm, the realization that not knowing is survivable, that ambiguity does not threaten coherence, that meaning can exist without structure. Others experience something different, a lingering humility, a recognition that human understanding has edges, and that those edges are not failures, but boundaries that shape perspective. In these versions, the story does not diminish human capability, it contextualizes it. There are accounts where people notice how rarely they encounter narratives that allow uncertainty to remain unchallenged. Most stories demand resolution. They close loops. They reward attention with clarity. This one does not. It asks for patience instead. And patience, some believe, is its quiet gift. The sea in this final phase is no longer referenced at all. Its role is complete. It held the moment. It absorbed the motion. It allowed the story to pause without conclusion. Nothing more is required of it. There are versions where the incident is mentioned one last time, almost casually. Not with gravity, not with emphasis. Just as a point of reference in a broader conversation about perception, expectation, or silence, its presence is understated but acknowledged. The story does not demand remembrance. It permits it. Some believe this permission is what allows the narrative to endure without distortion, because it does not ask to be believed, defended, or expanded. It does not recruit listeners into certainty. It leaves them where they are. There are tellings where someone reflects that the incident did not change what they think about the world. It changed how tightly they hold those thoughts. This distinction appears again and again in the final retellings. The idea that perspective can shift without belief being replaced, that openness does not require abandonment of reason, only flexibility. The pilot's experience, now distant and undefined, remains human, not elevated, not reduced, simply human. He encountered something that did not explain itself and moved within that encounter as best he could. No more is claimed, no less is honored. As the narrative finally settles, what becomes clear is not the nature of the lights, the cause of the descent, or the meaning of the silence. What becomes clear is the tone the story leaves behind, a tone of restraint, of attentiveness, of quiet acknowledgement. There are moments in human experience that do not ask to be solved, they ask to be carried. According to every version that endures, this was one of those moments. And perhaps that is why the story ends, not with an answer, but with a posture, looking up without expectation, listening without demand, remembering without insisting. The sky remains vast, the sea remains silent, and the space between them remains open, not empty, just open. There are versions that suggest the story does not truly end here, not because something else happened afterward, but because nothing ever fully closed. The sky returned to silence. The sea remained unchanged. Life continued in familiar rhythms, and yet the space left behind by that encounter never quite disappeared. This is often how unresolved moments persist, not as questions demanding answers, but as quiet recalibrations of awareness. Some believe the incident matters not for what it revealed, but for what it refused to explain. It offered no conclusion to defend, no truth to accept or reject. It simply existed, briefly intersecting with human experience before withdrawing without clarification. In doing so, it left something behind, a reminder that not every event arrives with meaning attached, that some experiences are complete without resolution. That uncertainty does not always signal failure, it can also signal boundary. The pilot's journey, as it is remembered, does not ask to be interpreted beyond what it allows. It resists heroism, blame, and certainty alike. It remains human in scale, even as it touches something that exceeded familiar frameworks. The lights, whatever they were, or were not, do not linger as objects of speculation here. They linger as a pause in expectation, as a moment when understanding stepped back and observation took its place. And perhaps that is the quiet significance of this story. It does not warn, it does not persuade, it does not reveal hidden truths. It simply reminds us that the world contains intersections we may never fully map. That perception can be genuine without being complete. And that meaning does not always arrive shaped like explanation. The sky remains open, the sea remains silent, and between them the unanswered space remains, not empty, not threatening, but available, waiting only to be noticed, not resolved.